Welcome to this Advanced Welsh Bacc student support screencast for the individual project. This video focuses on completing your source analysis. Hi everyone, just a reminder that your source analysis is a detailed analysis of the reliability and trustworthiness of your sources that you've used for your secondary research. So the success criteria for the source analysis is that you need to write in full, clear sentences. It is a piece of writing, so it needs to be written in that way and well expressed. You need to analyze 3 sources that you've used for your secondary data or information. You need to apply RURU to each source. A video will be shown in this screencast to support you with that aspect. And you also need to include a copy of the link or URL to the website or document that you've used. As a guide for A star, A and B, each source you should be looking for 200 to 500 words for each analysis. For a C then we're looking for a 200 word minimum. So, RURU. This was taught at GCSE, but as a reminder what it stands for reliability or reliable, up-to-date, relevant and useful. The next video will explain it in more detail, so I'll leave you watch the video now.
There's so much information around these days, it's hard to know what's credible or trustworthy. So you're going to have to look very carefully at sources to work out what's believable and what's not. Say you're researching climate change. Well, you're going to find a flood of information very quickly. This is where RURU can really help. It stands for relevant, up-to-date, reliable and useful. If you're researching tidal energy, it might be helpful to find articles about how the moon affects tides. But if an article goes on to explain in depth how lunar craters are named, it's no longer relevant to your project, even if it is interesting. Only seek out the information you really need, and don't get distracted. Always ask, when was this published? Try to get hold of the most recent research possible. Things change fast, and sometimes something published just a few years, or even only a few months ago, might be out of date today. Some articles say that climate change is the biggest problem the world is facing, whilst others say that climate change isn't a problem at all. They can't all be right. So it's crucial to be able to decide which sources are reliable. And that's not easy. Reliable information doesn't have a particular taste or smell. You need to think critically by asking, where has this information come from? A blog or an official website? Anybody can write a blog, so how reliable is it really? Somebody's probably written a blog explaining why all penguins are evil. That doesn't necessarily make it true. If it's the site of an organisation, for example, a news outlet, a university, a government or a private company, it might well mean the website is very official and impressive, but does that make it trustworthy? Sources can often have hidden agendas or reasons for posting information that you might not be aware of unless you do your research. If you read an article about how climate change isn't real and how fossil fuels are the future, and it's been published by an oil company, then that should ring some alarm bells over its reliability. What you're really looking for is organisations that always list their sources so that you can double-check them. Universities are a good example, as are official government websites or famous science institutions. For instance, nearly all scientists agree that the most trustworthy evidence about climate change can be found on the NASA website. Information may well be reliable, up-to-date and relevant, but will it actually be useful for your research? Question everything. Check whatever you can and you'll produce a project that's based on solid research, unless the penguins get to you first.
Okay, so that video explains what RURU stands for. So let's just go into a little bit more detail for you. Reliable, even though the video showed relevant as the first one, but reliable is what we suggest you look at first. Now, when deciding on whether a source is reliable, there's a few things you need to consider, and some of them overlap, but just bear with me at this point, okay? Impartiality, vested interest, bias, and expertise. Now, breaking down each of these, there are subtle differences when considering whether a source is reliable. So let's say you found a document or found a website that you're using, you need to start applying RURU to identify whether you can use this source. So impartiality, the kind of questions you need to ask yourself is the source taking a particular side? Does it have a motive to distort the truth and actively persuade? If it isn't taking a particular side or hasn't got a motive to distort the truth, it can be considered impartial and therefore reliable. Still on reliability, we're looking at vested interest. Another indicator of reliability involves deciding if the source has a vested interest. In other words, does the source have something to gain from protecting or promoting that interest? So it could involve making money, staying in a position of power, or creating a good reputation. So vested interest needs to be considered when a source is going to be deemed reliable or unreliable. Again, still on reliability, it is the largest part when you're looking at RURU. Bias. Reliability involves deciding if the source is biased. Now, you would have heard of that word before. It means kind of leaning one side, okay, and ignoring evidence that might contradict the one-sided view. Very often lacking a neutral viewpoint, and the opinion is very strongly held. Not having an open mind as a result of a prejudgment which could lead to prejudice. So if we think of examples, sometimes articles, personal articles that have been written, if you are using blogs from relevant, reliable people, let's say, which is going to be the next part, expertise, you need to kind of consider whether they are ignoring evidence that is on the other side of their point. So the final part of reliability is expertise. Now, this is essentially looking at people who are qualified to comment on the subject. Very often with expertise, it has to be someone who is an expert within that field. Someone who has got qualifications within that field. So if we think of David Attenborough, for instance, and let's say you're using an article that has been written by him, you've got to ask yourself, is it an expert that I'm using? It depends what he's talking about. If he's necessarily talking about football, okay, he wouldn't be considered an expert within that field. But if you're talking about the environment and wildlife, he certainly is an expert. So that is another aspect of reliability. Now, reliability is the most detailed part of RURU. The following three, they're up to date now. They're a lot easier to identify. So up to date. It is important to look at the date of the source. Information may go out of date and may mean it becomes inaccurate. There's an example there of how laws very often change within a short period, which if you are using that data or that information and then that information and data is countered by, let's say, a law change, it becomes unreliable. So it's very easy with up to date. As a general rule, anything over 3 years, at the very most 5 years, could be considered out of date. But that doesn't mean you don't use it. just because a source is old, it doesn't mean it's unreliable. It just means that you have to consider that time has passed from when it was first published. Very often it might be that the published information or data may actually be worse now. So if we're talking about, let's say, climate change, and the data you're using is from 2016, it's quite likely that the data regarding climate change it's probably got worse. So you would consider that in your source analysis. Okay, so relevant is basically identifying whether the source is relevant to the information that you're collecting. So when you're talking about news articles or breaking news, let's say, you would expect to find those sources on BBC websites or BBC News, let's say. So you've got to make sure that the information you've collected has come from a relevant source. So an example, okay, if you've got a news story that you've read that has come from, let's say, Facebook, there's issues there with whether it's come from a relevant source. It might be that it had been shared and it has originally come from the BBC News, which that would be your source, not Facebook. But it's just important to consider that it's coming from the right website, let's say. And finally, useful. This is more personal useful because obviously it's a source that you've been using and you've got to identify whether it's been useful for you. Some sources can be very difficult to read, and finding the information and data in a large report can be troublesome. So if you have come across that, and there's nothing wrong with you explaining that you found the source on the whole not particularly useful, however you did find a number of pieces of data which you could use. My advice is obviously to select sources which are useful, because completing a project with sources that you have not found useful is going to be very difficult. So just make sure that the three that you've used or you're doing your source analysis on are useful and you can justify why they've been useful. So if we're looking at an example, we mentioned at the start about sharing the link, the URL, and right at the top there you can see that is the URL to the data, which you can see on the left, which is a graph that indicates perceptions of youth and old age across Europe. And you've got all countries there identifying where they consider the end of youth and when they consider the start of old age. So what we're going to be doing now is doing a source analysis on this document. When we're looking at it, okay, we've got the document there and you can see you've got reliability, which covers all of those aspects that we shared at the start, such as bias and expertise, vested interest. You've then got just a sentence that talks about the date it was published, just a sentence talking about how it is relevant and then also how it is useful. This is the full example and how it should look on your page. So we've just combined all of those parts of Ruru into one paragraph, and that would be classed as one source analysis. So you need to be doing this 3 times. I hope that's been useful. Thanks for watching.